So our media panel, I think you're really going to enjoy. And first I want to introduce a very special friend of the Steamboat Institute who's going to moderate this panel. Khristine Brookes and her husband Peter, as you know, have been out to Steamboat many times. I believe this is the first time we've had Chris speak. It's obvious that the curse of the Yampa Valley is real because they keep coming back over and over again, and we're really happy about that. Chris has been the Vice President of Communications for the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. for the past 5 years. And prior to that, she was in a similar position with the Heritage Foundation. And she took us on a tour once and showed us the really cool TV studio that she had developed for the Heritage Foundation. And now she's doing great work at the Cato Institute. Chris grew up in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where a little known fact about her is she was a champion barrel racer, which is pretty cool. I know folks in Steamboat Springs are very impressed with that sort of thing. We're very happy that Peter, Chris, and Jack came back to Steamboat again for this weekend. I also want to point out that I mentioned earlier that Fox News will be covering the dinner with the Cheneys up on the mountaintop tonight. The way we made the initial contact with Fox News was through Chris Brookes. And I also want to let you know another little tidbit that we just learned within the last hour. Tomorrow night, live from Steamboat Springs at 8 o'clock p.m. Mountain Time, Reverend C.L. Bryant, who is our closing luncheon speaker tomorrow, will be featured on Geraldo Live on Fox News. So, very happy about that. So, let's give an enthusiastic welcome to Khristine Brookes and our media panel. Woohoo! Hey! You bet.
Hi, everybody. I feel like I know you all. I've been here so many times. And I got to tell you, Jennifer, you couldn't have picked a better song, Video Killed the Radio Star, because we're going to be talking a little bit about how internet killed the newspaper star or something like that. It's related. Anyway, I want to tell you just a little bit about kind of what I think about how the media landscape has changed, but then I want to get right into talking to our very distinguished panel. Excuse me. Okay, I'll get my microphone figured out. In 1980, when I was 12 years old and begging my parents to let me watch that cool new MTV channel that came out of our newfangled cable TV box, that was about 1980, 55 million people were getting their news from either Walter Cronkite, John Chancellor, Peter Jennings, or one of the other anchors that took over in those years. Today, NBC Nightly News leads the ratings race with a mere 5 million viewers. So you could say that there's been a bit of a downfall in people watching the evening news. Newspapers have suffered the same fate. The circulation figures of the Washington Post over the last 2 years have been about 500,000. That's down from probably about 1 million in their heyday. And only 2 of the top 50 circulation newspapers have experienced any sort of growth in the last 5 years. And that growth has been about 0.1%. So it's really, the newspapers really have taken a hit as well. And as Jennifer said, I'm in the media relations business. When I first started in Washington 20 years ago, most of our work was involved picking up the phone and calling a reporter and telling him the sort of research we had available and about events that they might want to cover. We'd also send those newfangled things called faxes a few years later. And sometimes we'd actually go visit reporters. And then email came along. Email came along, I think, sometime for Capitol Hill anyway, which was much after it came along for anybody else in the late 80s, early 90s. And there was that sort of golden age of email when you could actually, before spam, when you could actually send an email to somebody, and you had pretty much 100% confidence that that email would be read and someone would respond. But then spam came along, so the whole communications world changed. Like today, if I want to get Jamie Weinstein's attention, I tweet him, I don't email him. Or I just call Tucker Carlson in this case. But what I really want, and that's what I really want to talk to our panelists about today. I think you all know how the news media has changed because you all are consumers of media, and you know that you don't have to wait until 6 o'clock to turn on your evening news to find out what's going on. You can turn on cable news, or you can go to a website on your iPad, or if you've signed up for a million news alerts like I have, you can just look at your email to see what's breaking. And if you follow the right people on Twitter, that's your entire news feed. You don't need anything else. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But what you may not know is how this kind of morphing and growth of the news business has affected how journalists do their jobs. So I really want to get into talking to these two gentlemen about how they kind of go about gathering news and how they think it's changed over the years. So first, let me introduce our two distinguished panelists. Andrew Malcolm has been a national political columnist for Investors Business Daily since 2011, but I want to go back just a little bit in his career because it's very interesting. Mr. Malcolm graduated from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University in 1967, and 2 years later wrote his very first story for the New York Times. In the 26 years that he was with the Times, Andrew was a foreign correspondent, bureau chief, national affairs correspondent, editor, and columnist with assignments in Chicago, San Francisco, Vietnam, Thailand, Korea, Japan, and Canada. In 1973, he won the George Polk Award for investigative reporting. He was also recognized by the paper itself, winning the New York Times Publishers Award 18 times during his tenure there, which means at one point in time, the New York Times actually had good taste. After pretty much doing every job available at the New York Times, Andrew decided to do something totally different and went to work in the office of the governor of Montana, Mark Rasko, from 1993 to 1999. And then, having proven his chops at political communications, he was hired in 1999 by the George W. Bush campaign, and he was the spokesman and press secretary for Laura Bush. And if you missed that, yes, there was a New York Times reporter on the George W. Bush campaign. Like I said, times have changed. From there, Andrew went to the Los Angeles Times as a member of the editorial board and won both the National Headliners Award and the Distinguished Writing Award from the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Oh, and he was also a finalist for the Pulitzer in 2004. In his spare time, he's written 10 books, 2 of which were turned into movies. One of those movies starred Raquel Welch, and yes, Andrew did get to meet Raquel Welch. So he was talking a little bit about that. In October, Andrew brought his column to Investors Business Daily, where you can find it at investors.com/Andrew Malcolm. On Twitter, he's at @AHMalcolm. And then there's Jamie Weinstein. Jamie's the senior editor at the Daily Caller. The Daily Caller, for those who haven't heard of it, but I'm sure you've all heard of it, is the news and opinion website based in Washington, D.C. It was founded by my friend and one-time Cato colleague, Tucker Carlson, in 2010. And just 2 years after the site went up, the Caller had quadrupled page views and had a total audience, had become profitable without ever buying an advertisement for itself, which is really quite an accomplishment in the online news business. To date, the high water mark is 8 million unique users and 41 million page views per month. So the Daily Caller has it's really done quite well, and people, I think, were skeptical when it first started, so I gave a big thumbs up to my good friend Tucker Carlson and Jamie for that. Jamie graduated from Cornell University in 2006 and earned a master's degree in international relations at the London School of Economics in 2009. After a year-long fellowship at the Capitol Hill newspaper Roll Call, he plowed right into his work at the Daily Caller and has been there for the last 3 years. In addition to reporting on the major political events out of Washington, he also writes the exceedingly popular DC Morning Email. How many people subscribe? You all should. Jennifer does. Very good. Jamie has over 147,000 subscribers to that email and over 100,000 people following the Daily Caller on Twitter, which is not surprising since the DC Morning Email is written with a huge dose of the humor that got Jamie named the funniest celebrity in Washington 2 years ago. His work has appeared in the Weekly Standard, the New York Daily News, the Washington Examiner, and many other publications. He's a regular on the Fox News channel, which I'm sure you've all seen him on, and other cable news outlets. And in his spare time, he writes funny books, the most recent of which was political satire, and I love this title, The Lizard King, the shocking inside account of Obama's true intergalactic ambitions by an anonymous White House staffer. Jamie Weinstein. So I'm going to sit down to talk to these distinguished gentlemen. Can you all still hear me okay? Okay, good. So Andrew, I wanted to kind of open with the first question to you. You started your career in journalism before the advent of email. And
some people say before the advent of printing, but...
No, I was around in 1969, I remember that. I'd love to hear, this is an obvious question, but I'd like to hear from you because you've been with so many different newspapers and so many different roles. What's your perspective on how news gathering has changed over the years?
Well, everything has changed except one thing, and I'll get to that. I got interested in journalism in the 10th grade, and I said I wanted to be a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, and it took me 10 years, but I got there.
Wow.
It was the era of hot type. We then went into offset printing and electronics, and we used to have a machine to write on that was like a large suitcase. This was considered computerized. And if you were wearing a sweater, it would erase everything that you had just spent 3 hours writing. Great advantages. So everything has changed. You mentioned the movie with Raquel Welch. That was an NBC Monday night movie. Here's how things have changed. They were disappointed at NBC because they only got 26.3 million viewers.
Wow.
Now, they beat Monday Night Football, but they didn't beat Bob Newhart by 200,000 viewers.
Oh my goodness.
Okay? Now, today, we were talking with a movie producer just a few weeks ago. Today, on television, a huge hit is 11 million.
Oh yeah.
So that tells you how the entire market, both of entertainment and communications, has been fragmented. And so that has affected print journalism, obviously, and hopefully someday somebody will figure out how to do it and make money at it. I often refer to it as the pharmacy journalism, in the era that you mentioned of all those anchors. Walter Cronkite ended his show by saying, and that's the way it is. And we all thought, well, okay, 22 minutes, that's the way it is, and his show was mainly based off the New York Times front page that day, but it was the news that everybody got. Well, it isn't the way it is anymore. There are millions, literally millions. There's more than 100 million blogs. And most of them are crap, but there's 100 million blogs. You can get your news anywhere. And what that's done, we were talking about self-responsibility here basically all day, is that turns the responsibility to the consumer, okay? And everybody here. And if you don't have a daily personal routine of information gathering, you're falling down as a citizen. You need to find a half a dozen or so places that you trust. They'll be different. They will give you can triangulate the news then, but it's your responsibility to get informed. I write online and thousands of people come and read it, and when I was writing my blog on the LA Times, there were times, and talk about an almost orgasmic experience, there were times where I would write a story and within 15 minutes I could see the numbers. More than 30 people per second were arriving to read the story, and that would go on for 5 or 6 hours. Wow. So you're talking about millions of people a month, hundreds of thousands a day. Now, I got into journalism just before Watergate, so my mission in journalism was not to fix society, to fix government, to dig out wrongdoing. My goal was to tell stories. As you might have guessed by now, I like to talk and tell stories. I dominated Sharon Fain in the 6th grade, and I didn't have much to show, but I sure had a lot to tell. And I went on from that into journalism to tell stories, and my style was to tell them through individual people, because it's the kind of story I could relate with. That didn't fit with the New York Times for a long time. Now it does, and now I'm online and I can tell a story any way I want, anytime I want. So it's ideal for me, all these changes.
Well, let me ask Jamie a question. This is something we had talked about a little earlier, going back to your point about the media being fragmented. It's a challenge now. Every news organization has a challenge in drawing readers because people have so many choices out there. The Daily Caller, if you've ever looked at its front page, has very interesting ways of drawing readers in because they do very hard journalism, but they also do some lighter stuff. So Jamie, talk a little bit about how the Daily Caller handles that kind of fragmented, they're sensitive,
Sorry,
that fragmented audience.
Sure. I mean, I think when Tucker started this, he often said that you can't force people to read articles. A lot of newspapers are dying. You can't make people read them. You have to draw an audience in. There's no way you can stick a gun to their head and say, read the New York Times or read the Washington Post. They need readership. They need to expand and make money and be profitable. So you have to make it entertaining for the reader. That doesn't mean it has to be less rigorous in facts. You follow the basic journalistic principles. The story has to be right. You have to make sure it's fact-checked. You have to use basic grammar. But you can write it in a way that's interesting, that might draw a reader in, tell stories, as you said. But you also can include, as we do on our site, other things that are interesting and entertaining to a reader. You can read a hard news story on our site, and I might have a satirical column next to it. So we give the readers lots of options. And I think so far that's been a success. People tend to like to come to us for a variety of different types of articles, video, both serious and humor, articles both serious and humor, and our slideshows. So I think that has turned out to be a winning combination so far.
The way I put it is, if people don't want to come, you can't stop them.
Yeah, that's a very good way to put it. Well, let's go back to talking about the news gathering for a second. Certainly, there's a lot of people that you may want to talk to as sources for various stories. The trust element that you were talking about earlier, that may or may not be present with some news organizations now, has that made your job a little harder, since there's so many news organizations out there right now, or, well, pseudo-news organizations, that may not be following journalistic standards? Has that made your job any harder?
A little bit, but I think that's more benefit than loss. When you work for the New York Times, I should say to everybody, please, I left in 1993, so I am not responsible for the new New York Times.
So they used to have good taste.
But when you called from the New York Times, you could be an idiot, but they would take the call. And usually, except for the White House. And so my little trick on the White House, except for the individual departments. So my little trick was to call the White House, be ignorant, say, I need to talk to the so-and-so in the Labor Department. And they would switch me to the Labor Department. Guess what? They took calls that were coming through the White House switchboard. So that worked out. Anyway, it was automatic credibility because of the institution. Then I was in politics for 9 years in government and learned how, surprisingly, to my mind, this may sound naive, but corrupt most of the media is, the mainstream media, in the sense of twisting and distorting and selectively choosing and selectively editing. And I learned that very quickly, and I learned to use it to my advantage as a representative, a spokesman for politicians and an arranger. Then on the editorial board, that was pretty much self-contained writing editorials, but as a blogger or columnist for the LA Times and now, well, the LA Times, we were automatically accepted. IBD, you're accepted in conservative circles immediately. I haven't had that problem because if you're good at what you do, I'm not saying I am, but I hope I am.
Oh, all those awards I was to say that you are.
But if you're good at what you do, and if you tell good stories, people will come. It's like building the baseball field in Field of Dreams. They do. They don't come as quick as you'd like. But remember, what's the most important thing in our lives? I think it comes down to three things, right? That you see in history: politics, prostitution, and stories, right? And the Bible is stories. The cave drawings in France, they didn't have a language, but they were stories. My father tucked me into bed every night with stories. Thanksgiving is all about stories. You've heard them every Thanksgiving since your childhood, and you're going to hear them for a long time. But they're stories. That's what unites us. We love stories. There's about 14 kinds of stories, I think, in history, right? There's David and Goliath. That's Rocky. And Rocky 7, or whatever it is now. There's Cinderella, and that became Pretty Woman and My Fair Lady and all of the others. So there are these classes of stories that every other story spins off of. And if you develop your storytelling technique, people want stories. So every one of my columns is a story. It's a self-contained story. It has news in it, it has commentary, but there's a beginning and there's an end.
Jamie, let's go talk a little bit about TV media, since you do quite a bit of that. I was kind of disappointed as a fan of what I call hard news with the amount of coverage the George Zimmerman trial got. Fox News Channel, CNN, everybody seemed to be covering it kind of wall to wall. And I was talking to Jake Tapper at CNN and giving him kind of a hard time because he usually does sort of a hard news show. And he said, oh, this is a very important story about race relations. And I said, well, it might be at the end, but this wall-to-wall coverage of the minutia of the trials seems to just be voyeurism. Do you have any interpretation on what it was about this story that was hooking the TV media, at least?
Well, I think race was part of it.
Yeah.
There was somewhat of an uncertain outcome, so it was drama. You had the trial, you don't know what's going to happen at the end. But I'll also say that for as much coverage as the mainstream media did on this, it didn't educate the audience very well. I remember going on Facebook after the verdict, and I thought it was a very serious case with serious implications. Race relations are a serious thing. You shouldn't treat them so lightly. And people on Facebook were acting as if Stand Your Ground was a major decider here, and they're having comments to my friends from high school who might have been more liberal. Well, Stand Your Ground was not something that was pursued as a defense. That was thrown out in the very beginning. The defense didn't even use it because it was not necessary. But it seems like most of the people, at least judging from I was seeing on Twitter and on Facebook, thought that Stand Your Ground was the whole issue here, and Stand Your Ground was the problem. So not only did they, I think, overcover it in many ways, they didn't cover it in a way that people actually got the information, because at the end of the day, it seemed like a lot of people were misinformed about the basic facts of the case.
It seems, the TV media, just like any news business, is a business. At the end of the day, they want to put something on the air that they think viewers want to see that will draw advertisers. There must have been something telling these people that, oh yeah, they'll want all the minutia of this trial.
Well, there's no question that I think it drew ratings. Look at Court TV or HLN, which is CNN's headline news, kind of their secondary cable network. That was beating. It was getting the best ratings it was getting all year. It was beating MSNBC, which I know that sounds like a low bar, but it doesn't usually beat MSNBC. So it was getting, especially for CNN, was getting great ratings. I think the 10 p.m. show that Anderson Cooper had two shows, one at 8, one at 10. Their 10 p.m. was, I think, entirely devoted during the trial to the George Zimmerman case. And that, I think, is indicative of how well the ratings were doing, that they took a time slot and dedicated entirely to discussing the George Zimmerman case with 4 attorneys or 4 defense lawyers.
And the OJ trial did much the same thing.
Yeah.
I can remember working in the governor's office in Montana and going and trying to find a co-worker, and there were no women to be found. And I heard a lot of noise, so I went into the press secretary's office, and every woman in the entire, there were about 18 or 19 women, all watching remember the car drive all around
the
LA.
White Bronco.
And I don't think it was to check the traffic. They were watching because who knew what would happen? That's the immediacy of you don't know what's happened, what might happen, and that's exciting. But why it's around a trial has always puzzled me.
And at the exclusion of what were they covering this? So they were covering the Trayvon Martin trial, but not the Fort Hood trial. Maybe because we already know the outcome. I don't think there's much chance that the Fort Hood shooter is going to be convicted, but that seems like maybe a more important thing to cover at the expense of the Gosnell situation and trial that was going on. That wasn't covered for a very long time.
Well, and the actual time that they were covering, Trayvon Martin, CNN at one point did a split screen with the streets of Egypt on fire, and Trayvon Martin's ex-girlfriend. It was one of the most surreal things I've ever seen on TV. But they were trying to juggle what they felt were competing audiences, which I thought was very interesting.
And there's little question that what drew more ratings for them was the Trayvon Martin case and not Egypt. Egypt. Foreign journalism, unfortunately, I can tell you by looking at traffic numbers at the Daily Caller, just doesn't draw that much of an audience. And as someone who, a master's degree is in international history, that's what I like, and that's what I try to write about. Those articles that I write on foreign policy are not usually high trafficked.
Can I go back a little bit? You asked about what had changed, and of course the social media is a huge revolution. And I know everybody making fun of, they don't want to know what Ashton Kutcher had for breakfast on Twitter. Frankly, I don't follow him, but I don't care either. But it is a measure of what the buzz is, what people are talking about. And I have gotten, my wife, I believe, calls it addicted, but I love Twitter for the ease and the instantaneousness of communicating. Now, I've got 117,000 followers, so I've got a lot of back and forth, and we have good discussion. Anybody here can feel free to join in, join the crowd. But it's the kind of communication that you didn't have in the old days of print journalism. As a reporter in those days, you'd write the story, give it to the editor, he'd screw it up, they'd put it in the paper the next day, and that was it, okay? Now, you write a story, it's online, within minutes, you have people commenting on it, sharing it, passing it around.
Well, and this is something that we at the Cato Institute, we usually have 60 to 70 interns, and while I'm talking to the interns, I realize that this is a phenomenon with a lot of young people. They are accustomed to being able to instantly react to a news story. Picking up a hard copy newspaper is worthless to them.
Oh, I know.
Because they can't, they'll read the story and then they'll look around for someone to tell what they think of it. Because they're accustomed to reading something online and being able to immediately comment on it, share it with their friends, and let people know what they think. So
Well, the
Twitter
instantaneity
especially.
or instantaneousness is everywhere, right? I mean, when I was a kid, it wasn't a 24-hour grocery store. There weren't convenience stores that were open all night. You could, if you didn't go to the bank by 3, you're screwed. But now we have 24-hour ATMs. Everybody likes that, and they can make fun of the personal part on Twitter, but they don't mind the personal part in terms of getting money for the trip tomorrow because I forgot all about it.
I'll say one other thing I think that Twitter is invaluable for. Of course, there's the instant communication back and forth, but if you follow, and you don't have to, you have so many followers, you don't have to follow all their news feeds. You can create a list, and if you follow the right people, the right group of journalists and foreign policy thinkers or whatnot, you can find all the articles you can read in a day because they'll link to them. I wake up, the first thing I do is go to Twitter, I look at my following. I have one foreign policy scholar that I follow. He'll link to, he must be based somewhere that he's up all hours of the night, or at least when I'm sleeping. Every important foreign policy article in the morning, he'll have linked to. I'll be able to get to it instantly. That's what people are talking about. And it's, I think, a great source to find.
And they have
most important news of
the hashtag sorting system, which I don't know if you know about it, but a hashtag TCOT means top conservative on Twitter. So if you're a conservative, you don't even have to be on Twitter, but you can go in and search hashtag TCOT, and you'll see all of my items, but you can see every other story that people have thrown into that dumper
It's kind of taken the
about
place
conservative and
of an
get a
aggregator.
tour of the horizon for that day.
We used to, there's aggregators out there everywhere, obviously, Ripple Politics and everything else, but if you, like Jamie said, if you're following the right people on Twitter, that's your aggregator. You're going to get all the big news, and we use it a lot in Washington Press is very addicted to Twitter. So you may see something pop up on Twitter from a journalist who was just, talking to a White House official long before a story's ever written about it. So you can really kind of stay ahead of things. Okay, I'm going to ask one more political question, and then I'm going to start asking for questions from the audience because I really want to know what you guys are interested in. Politics. Obviously, the Daily Caller, very interested in politics. What is your sense of how, especially the rise of online journalism, has changed the way politicians communicate? I know that's a very big topic. See if you can pick the top 5.
Well, there's a lot of politicians who now communicate through Twitter. There's a favorite parlor game in Washington is that Chuck Grassley is a great Twitter communicator. He tweets very funny things. Sometimes you don't even understand what they mean, but everyone follows Chuck Grassley on Twitter. And there's news stories from what the politicians tweet. Sometimes it's their staff, and they'll tweet something, and they have to delete it because they realize that we shouldn't have tweeted that. Or there was an interesting story of
and there's a page that collects deleted tweets.
You can never delete it. They think you can delete it. It's always there. There's Steve Cohn. He's a Democratic congressman from Tennessee, and it was during, I think, the State of the Union. He tweeted at some follower of his some kind of very warm tweet, and it was the picture of her was in a bikini. And he said, "Oh no, this is my long-lost daughter that we just discovered." Now, several months later, we find out he's not his daughter. So he says he just found out that they had tested it was not his daughter. So now people are looking into was that a real excuse? Was it not a real excuse? So they make a lot of faux pas on Twitter. So you can never delete it. It's always there.
Twitter is a permanent record.
Ask Anthony Weiner.
That's right.
Yes, exactly. Okay, let's get some questions from you folks. Do we have a microphone? Gary's got a microphone.
Yeah, let me ask you a quick one that I'm sure you've already heard many times. Do you think that the newspapers are really going to die?
Well, they're going to die in the form that I grew up with. That is, as a main source of news on a piece of paper. When I grew up, as I mentioned earlier, the pharmacy form of journalism, where journalists would put on their white coats like the pharmacists, and you would come up to the counter every morning or afternoon, and they would hand you the dose of news that they decided was good. And you would take it and go home, and that was it. Like, that's the way it is. Well, that's not the case anymore. I had an editor, this is 5 years ago, on the Los Angeles Times when I was talking about the blog, which some of my colleagues didn't like because of the politics, among other things. And he said to me, "You mean you would actually write a story and post it online just because you think someone would want to read it?" and the ridiculousness of that question. And I said, "You bet your sweet ass, John." And not only that, I'd find another way to come back at it tomorrow morning. And I said, "I had 5 million page views this month. How's the Sunday circulation going?" I think print newspapers are going to go away as print newspapers, but they're going to stick around, hopefully, because they're major news gatherers, like them or not. It's a huge investment they make. There's all kinds of experiments going on. The Orange County Register is doing one where they're actually hiring more people to make the product more worthwhile. The Wall Street Journal has a paywall. Investors Business Daily has a paywall, but only for the investment side. The news side isn't, to draw people in. No, I hope they figure it out.
And it's going to lead, I think, to some innovation as well. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
you can go. I know you used the New York Times as an example. I was reading; they had a big post on Saturday Night Live on its 40th years coming up, and you would go down the page, and it was talking to some of the old Saturday Night Live comedians and some of the newer ones as well about their first edition and how it was like. And in the middle of the page, there's a video, so you could see Jimmy Fallon's edition on Saturday Night Live. You couldn't do that in print. You can't click a video in the middle of a story to get that to make it a more full experience. And you're going to be able to do that and you are able to do that online in a lot of ways. And I think it's going to lead to even more innovation.
Well, and I think, like Andrew said, the news gathering organizations probably will still be there, but more and more people are going to start reading, something that looks like a newsprint on their Kindle, on their iPad. The idea of newsprint, I think, is
And they can do it
gone.
like an ATM. They can do it whenever the heck they want, for however. It's like beachcombing.
Gary?
Chris, over here.
Where?
Chris, over.
Ah, there. Okay, thank you.
Hi, thanks
Bright
for being
lights in your
here.
face.
I'm sure I'm in the majority here for being sad that journalism seems to have become less about truth and fact-finding and a bit more about entertainment and propaganda, thank you. And so I've become interested and kind of curious about looking at the money trail and the agendas behind media channels, which is not all that hard to do. For example, Town Hall magazine, August of 2011, featured an investigative article in which they determined or decided that George Soros subsidizes 180 media channels. And I thought, I wonder if that explains why his politicians are Teflon and keep getting elected, the Clintons, Al Franken, Barack Obama, and others. And maybe it explains why we don't learn more about their abuses, like Benghazi, the IRS, the DOJ, the NSA, and so forth. This is very disturbing. Shouldn't there be more transparency, or should we be more curious and proactive as citizens? And what are your thoughts?
Jamie? You want to take that one?
I tend to think sometimes we put too much into funders. I think there's other things that are going on there. I'm sure, certainly that George Soros likes what he sees, so he's going to fund what he likes. Sometimes it's the chicken, the egg, or the egg, type of scenario. I think a lot of times, I worked at Roll Call newspaper. I thought everyone there was, which is the Capitol Hill newspaper, really believed they were doing the right thing. Sometimes it's an unconscious bias that occurs. There's a lot of people in the media that, in a way, are in love with President Obama. So if they're not asking about Benghazi, they kind of buy his line. Or if they're saying that the IRS scandal is a phony scandal before it's fully investigated, they're buying the White House line because they're giving him the benefit of the doubt. Is that because George Soros might be contributing to their organization? I don't think so. I think it's an unconscious bias or a conscious bias in some cases that they tend to have political views that are more similar one way or the other. It's like the famous New Yorker story. From 1972, after the election of Richard Nixon, where the writer was lamenting after the election, you know, I can't believe that Richard Nixon won. Before the election, I didn't know a single person that was going to vote for him. Richard Nixon won 49 states. She was living in a bubble, the writer. And I think there is this bubble that exists in Washington especially.
But that's the beauty of the new world online, and we get back to that responsibility I mentioned earlier. You found that on your own. That's been out for years, okay? But you found it, and now you're going to share it with other people, the other people here who knew about it. Some people will go and tweet or Google or Bing George Soros, and they'll find out more about it. He has a vast financial influence. He funds Media Matters, which is the watchdog of me and the others in the conservative world. And editors quickly learn not to pay any attention to it, but it gives MSNBC questions for their afternoon shows. I'm serious.
For all 10,000 people that are watching.
I would place the responsibility on everyone to find the sources that they trust, to research those sources, and maybe some of them you end up not trusting because you see that, oh, they kind of exaggerated that, so maybe I'm going to look somewhere else. There's the obvious ones. I see Yahoo just passed Google as the main news site, so obviously Yahoo's doing something to attract more people, and it's not just the chairman's new baby.
Another question.
Yeah,
Rich?
we have some of us watch, you know, whether it's CNN or Fox, whatever, you get these little snippets of today it's, you know, it's Jay Carney and the press briefings and that sort of thing, and I just can't help but watch that and think what a massive waste of time that is.
Could you speak up a little, please?
Oh, have you guys ever participated in those press briefings, and why are they still hanging around? Is there any value in that?
We have a White House correspondent that chooses mainly not to go because they are an abundant waste of time, Neil Monroe. We did send our intern a couple weeks ago.
And if you didn't see the story on that,
who asked a very relevant question and made a big pickup. He was 16 years old, and everyone was questioning, you know, why do we have a 16-year-old at a White House briefing? Well, he was asking a question at least that everyone else asked some of the silliest questions there. Sometimes, when Jake Tapper was there, he occasionally would ask some really tough questions, but often the time it's nonsense.
Ed Henry has taken his role over there, from Fox. It is an element of communications, and if you're interested in what is the White House line, you can get a lot from it. Not that you necessarily would agree with it, but you can get a feel for what angle they're going at. The video, the Benghazi video, they were hawking on that for a long time. Then you could see them start to waffle on it. And so you can read these nuances that may be a bit more detailed than average consumers would like, but you can do that. I happen to love C-SPAN. And by the way, let me make a pitch because they don't pay me anything, not George Soros or anybody. CSPAN.org has, they opened it up last year, a video library that is to die for, okay? Everything C-SPAN has broadcast since 1987, searchable by name, by terms. You get the video. You want to hear what Hillary Clinton told the House committee in 1993? The transcript is right next to it. You can edit it out and make a 1.5-minute segment if you want yourself. And it's a vast resource that is underutilized by the news media as well as the public.
In fact, about 2 hours ago, I did that very thing to file a story. I edited it from a 1993 clip in the Reagan Library. It's a really amazing resource.
I'm also a big C-SPAN fan. If you want to, the greatest thing about C-SPAN is they send a camera, they don't tell you what to think, they record it, they let you watch it.
And you can see Dick Cheney next week on C-SPAN.
Yeah, they'll be here tonight. Another question.
Yes, to carry this lady's question a little farther, do you believe that we as consumers of news have a right to find out about the political affiliation or contributions made by the purveyors of news? Either one of you or both.
I think most reporters and most news organizations, they wouldn't be allowed to donate to political campaigns. But I
Look
think
under their wife's name.
I think the executives, I think in some partisan organizations, I'm not sure, in New York Times, were you allowed to?
No way. In fact, all Christmas gifts had to be returned. For some reason, they never learned that. I don't think you'll find them donated. They do their work quietly with words, not with money. And they don't need that much money. But if you are interested, you can go to the Federal Election Commission and you can search their database and see who's given. I did it once a few years ago and found out that Roy Scheider, remember him from Jaws? That he had donated to the Obama campaign. Unfortunately, he had died the month before. So there was a little kerfluffle over that. And turns out he'd given his credit card to make a monthly donation, and they kept doing it even though he was gone.
Another question?
Hi, my name's Sharon Fain, and I worked for NBC News and also Fox News Channel in New York. I was their national editor. And I made it a personal policy not to vote, which I've since changed since I left Fox News Channel. But I just want to say that there are some journalists, to mention the gentleman's question, that do have personal values and have decided to try to maintain an unbiased opinion.
Yeah.
That's very good to hear. Thank
Well,
you
when
so
I
much.
left the New York Times in 1993, everybody was surprised that I went to a Republican, worked for a Republican governor. I had changed my registration every 2 years. I've been a member of every party except communists and Lyndon LaRouche, in case anybody went to look. And I was professional, and what I said surprised me when I went into government was that the people I thought were professionals really weren't. You know, they were trying to screw me, or they were trying to get me to work with them to screw somebody else.
Another question? I got a bright light in my face here, so if someone else can see if a hand's up.
Hold on, got one over here.
Hank. Oh, got one. Okay.
Any comments on Drudge or Breitbart or Blaze or any of those?
Jamie, any thoughts on
Drudge remains extremely influential, especially for online media. If you get a link on Drudge, that's a very big deal. You're going to get a lot of traffic. It remains outsized influence in the sense that, it will be a significant part of most online media's traffic per month.
I first met him when he was just starting out, and it was just right about the time of Monica. And he's a strange fellow, but he and the people he employs from his waterfront penthouse in Miami, they have the most amazing skill to pick out stories that you didn't know you wanted to read until you saw the headline, and then you absolutely have to read it. And that's why it works. And, pardon?
That's really the key to an aggregator, is
knowing what people want to read. And you read the headlines, and I go there, and I spend hours every day online, and there's stuff that I hadn't seen because of the unique way they do it. It's capitalism. It works. You give the people what they want, and 24 million people, or 24 or 30 million clicks a day he gets. Now the trick is, he refreshes his page every 2 minutes. If you're on there and suddenly everything goes away and then it comes back, there's an automatic refresh. So if 1 million people are on there, he gets 1 million new clicks.
And it's the simplest site probably there is, and arguably the most significant. And he does limited amount of advertising. He has not maxed out the profits the way he could, but believe me, he's making a lot of money because there's not very much overhead in his operation.
He's been around for a long time.
Wait, you asked about the other sites. The other sites are regular stops for me. I love Instapundit. I love Hot Air, or as Governor Perry calls it, hot gas. I love Rare. I don't know if any of you here has tried Rare. That's the new Cox Communication conservative Rare website, rare.com. It's brand new this spring. Also Lucianne.com, Lucianne Goldberg. I don't know if anybody remembers her name, but she was the literary agent who actually put Drudge on the map because she was a friend of Monica's. or friend of Monica's.
Okay, we're going to do one more question, then I think it's going to be time to head up the mountain here pretty soon. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I want to ask about the incestuousness inside the Beltway between the White House Press Corps, or the General Washington Press Corps, and the White House and Capitol Hill. Tom Brokaw recently said that the White House Correspondents' Dinner was too embarrassing to attend anymore. So I'd like to, and then there's the relationship, spouses working in government and working in the media. So I'd like to hear about that from either one of you.
You're the Beltway guy.
Of course, there's a famous book out now, This Town, by Mark Leibovich, a New York Times Magazine reporter who kind of delves into that very subject of...
And not in a nice way.
He
has no friends left.
He pulled his punches, though. He could have been much harsher than he was. I think the big question in D.C., will Mark Leibovich be able to have lunch in this town again? And he will be able to have lunch in this town again. But there is kind of an incestuous nature in a lot of ways. It probably affects coverage. You don't want to hurt your friends. I mean, of course, Andrea Mitchell, she covers, at NBC, things that were relating to her time with the husband was Alan Greenspan at the Fed. So there is this kind of incestuous relationship, and sometimes it probably affects coverage. So yeah, I mean, I do think to some extent it's certainly a problem.
But once again, you now have the freedom and the resources to find that out yourself. And don't be shy about it. Find it out, and then you develop a Twitter following and point it out. Andrea Mitchell said this about her former husband. Big shocker here. And Britt Hume does it, actually. I follow Britt Hume, and he's wondrous at that. He took down they did a hatchet job. Who was it? The Beast did a hatchet job on Senator Cruz. And he took them down for the shoddy journalism. I mean, their sources were freshmen in high school with Cruz. They did no work on it. So you can, by reading these people, by sending out your own, people will retweet you, you'll learn new followers and go back. And you can actually keep a pretty good check and balance, at least from your own consumer's point of view, news consumers, which is what counts. And Jamie and I are putting stuff out there for you guys to pick and choose from.
We did a report during the debates on the vice presidential debate. The moderator attended President Obama's wedding. She was at that time married to who was the former FEC chair who went to law school with Obama. Now, maybe that didn't affect her at all, and I thought she did an okay job, but it is one of those things that this is like the presidential stakes you hear. You'd think that you could find maybe one person to moderate who didn't attend one of the 4 people who are running for office's wedding. You think that just part of common impartiality to avoid an appearance of a problem.
And that's not unique to Washington. I mean, I suspect there's some incestuousness in Steamboat Springs. And I suspect maybe newspapers in Denver don't write certain ways about certain people that they like. But I did a tweet back in the debates in 2008, Obama and Hillary. And you'll be surprised to know that the CNN panel of analysts thought that clearly Hillary won. The panel of analysts was James Carville, David Gergen,
Paul Begala.
And Begala, and Paul Begala. All of whom had worked for her husband. And none of that was disclosed. So if you aren't out there gathering this information yourself, you go, well, I guess maybe Hillary won. Well, or maybe the fix is in. And they said nothing about it on the show. They didn't say these people have all worked. James Carville had actually sent out a fundraising letter 2 months before for Hillary, and he thought she won, which was a shock to me, and so I tweeted it.
So I think that's probably a good place to close, because as I said, the news business is a business, and you are the customers. And what you decide to buy and what you decide not to buy will decide whether that business continues. So I would highly recommend that you choose your news carefully, and like Andrew said, triangulate it. Look at different sources, figure out what you trust, and then go there. And if enough people are not going to the untrustworthy and shady news sites, they're going to go away. So really, it's up to you. So I hope you all learned something today, and everybody have a good time up on the mountain tonight. Big change.